Dr. Richard Hawthorne stared at the burnt remains of what was supposed to be Rigelian pancakes, wondering if there was a scientific formula for culinary disaster. The smoke alarm's shrill protest echoed through their habitat dome, and he could practically hear Serafina's gentle laughter from the botanical lab 3 levels down. "Arya, shut off the alarm before my wife thinks I'm conducting chemical warfare again," he muttered, waving a dish towel at the sensor. "Dar. Hawthorne, your cooking has been classified as a potential biohazard 17 times this month. Perhaps we should alert the xenobiology department." The station's AI managed to sound simultaneously helpful and sarcastic, which Richard found both impressive and annoying. He scraped the charcoal remnants into the recycler and glanced out the viewport at Jupiter's swirling storms. Europa Station hung in the gas giant's shadow like a mechanical moon, its biodomes and research modules gleaming against the cosmic backdrop. 5 years of marriage, and he still couldn't master breakfast. Serafina never complained, though he'd caught her discreetly ordering nutrition packets when she thought he wasn't looking. The habitat door chimed, and Serafina glided in with that peculiar grace she possessed, as if gravity were merely a suggestion. Her auburn hair was swept up in its usual style, carefully concealing the elegant points of her ears, a quirk she'd always been self-conscious about, claiming they made her look different. Richard had always found them beautiful, the way they tapered to delicate points like something from an ancient fairy tale. Attempting Rigelian cuisine again, she asked, her amber eyes twinkling with barely suppressed mirth. She had a way of making even his failures feel endearing. Key word being, attempting. "I think I may have accidentally created a new form of carbon allotrope." He gestured helplessly at the blackened pan. "The molecular bonds were apparently stronger than I anticipated." Serafina reached up unconsciously to touch her left ear, a nervous habit she developed whenever she was trying not to laugh. "Perhaps we could stick to Terran breakfast foods. I've grown quite fond of that earth thing called cereal. Where's your sense of adventure? Yesterday's Andromedan toast wasn't that bad." "Richard, darling, it was still moving. That's how you know it's fresh." He pulled her close, inhaling the faint scent of ozone and something floral that always seemed to cling to her hair. "Besides, Arya's been helping me research proper xenobiological nutrition protocols for humans." Dr. Hawthorne's research consists primarily of consulting cooking videos from the public database and ignoring safety warnings, Arya interjected. "I have documented 43 instances of him saying, 'How hard can it be?' followed immediately by structural damage to kitchen equipment." Serafina pressed her face against his shoulder to muffle her laughter. "Maybe we should focus on your actual research instead of culinary experimentation. How did the subsurface sample analysis go?" Richard's expression shifted to genuine excitement. "Fascinating results. We found bioluminescent organisms at depths where conventional wisdom says life shouldn't exist. They're producing light through a process I've never seen before, not standard chemiluminescence, but something that seems to tap into quantum fluctuations in the vacuum energy." Quantum bioluminescence. Serafina's interest seemed to sharpen, though she quickly masked it with casual curiosity. "That sounds unprecedented." "Completely. These organisms are essentially living light generators powered by the fundamental structure of spacetime itself. It's like finding bacteria that photosynthesize using dark matter." He pulled up a holographic display showing the microscopic creatures, their bodies pulsing with ethereal blue radiance. "I keep thinking there's something familiar about the light patterns, but I can't place it." Serafina studied the display intently, her fingers unconsciously tracing the pointed tip of her ear through her hair. "Perhaps it's similar to some of the aurora patterns we see in Jupiter's magnetosphere. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just seeing patterns where none exist. Scientists are notorious for that." He dismissed the hologram and turned back to his wife. "Speaking of which, how's your botanical work going? Any new discoveries in the extremophile gardens?" "Nothing as exciting as your quantum bacteria. Though I did find some interesting root systems that seem to extend much deeper than we initially thought. Almost as if they're reaching for something. She moved to the viewport, gazing out at the star field beyond Jupiter's bulk. Sometimes I wonder what else might be out there, waiting to be discovered. Getting homesick again? Richard joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her waist. I know Europa Station isn't exactly the most romantic location for newlyweds. Not homesick, exactly. Just thinking about connections. How everything in the universe is linked in ways we don't always understand. She leaned back against him. Do you ever wonder if we're alone out here, Richard? Really alone? Statistically speaking, the universe is too vast for Earth to be the only planet with intelligent life. But finding it? That's another matter entirely. He kissed the top of her head. Though I've got all the intelligent life I need right here. That was remarkably cheesy, even for you, Arya commented. I'm updating your romantic dialogue subroutines. They appear to be corrupted. Thank you, Arya. Your input is always valued. Richard made a mental note to review the AI's personality matrix again. How about we take a walk around the observation deck? The aurora should be spectacular tonight. They made their way through the station's corridors, past laboratories humming with activity and viewports offering glimpses of the cosmic dance outside. Other researchers nodded as they passed, Dr. Chen from the geology department, Professor Nakamura from atmospheric studies, the various technicians who kept the station running smoothly in the hostile environment of space. The observation deck was nearly empty, just a few couples and solitary stargazers scattered along the transparent aluminum windows. Jupiter dominated the view, its great red spot glaring like a cosmic eye while sheets of charged particles painted rainbow curtains across its polar regions. Beautiful, Serafina whispered, but Richard noticed she was looking beyond Jupiter, toward the constellation Lyra visible in the distance. Penny for your thoughts. Just wondering what's out there. Whether anyone's looking back at us. She pressed her palm against the cool window. Do you think first contact will happen in our lifetime? Honestly? I hope so. Can you imagine the scientific implications? The cultural exchange? Though knowing humanity, we'd probably start by trying to sell them extended warranties and teaching them our social media platforms. Serafina laughed, a sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. I can picture it now. Welcome to Earth, where we'll argue about anything and make reality shows about it. Don't forget the cooking competitions. We definitely challenge them to cooking competitions. Richard grinned. Though based on my recent attempts, maybe we should let them teach us. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Jupiter's storms swirl in patterns that had persisted for centuries. Richard felt that familiar sense of contentment that came from sharing the universe's wonders with someone who truly appreciated them. Serafina's presence made even the most mundane moments feel extraordinary. I should get back to the lab, Serafina said eventually. The culture samples need to be monitored every few hours, and Dr. Williams will have my head if I let them contaminate. I'll walk you down. I want to check on those quantum bacteria anyway. They've been exhibiting some unusual behavior patterns. They made their way to the biological research level, where the corridors were lined with specialized laboratories and containment units. Serafina's botanical lab was a marvel of controlled environments, with sample containers maintaining dozens of different atmospheric compositions and temperature ranges. See you at dinner? Richard asked, reluctant to leave her. Of course. And Richard? Maybe tonight we could just order something from the cafeteria. Give your culinary ambitions a rest. Where's your faith in my abilities? Safely stored in a fire suppression system, she replied with a grin, disappearing into her lab. Richard spent the afternoon lost in data analysis, trying to understand the quantum bacteria's impossible biology. The more he studied them, the more convinced he became that they represented something entirely new. A form of life that had evolved beyond conventional biochemistry into something that bordered on the metaphysical. It was late evening when he finally made his way back to their quarters, exhausted but exhilarated by the day's discoveries. The habitat was dark, which wasn't unusual. Serafina often worked late when her cultures needed attention. But something felt different. Wrong. The air held a strange stillness, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Richard called out her name, but only silence answered him. A quick check of their bedroom confirmed his growing unease. Her clothes were gone, her personal items missing. On the kitchen table, where his burnt breakfast had been, sat a single flower unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its petals seemed to contain the same ethereal light as his quantum bacteria, pulsing with patterns that made his eyes water if he looked too directly. The flower was impossibly beautiful and utterly alien, its very existence defying every principle of botany he knew. Richard reached for his communicator with trembling fingers. "Aria, locate Serafina Hawthorne." Dr. Serafina Hawthorne's biometric signature is not currently detected anywhere on Europa Station, the AI replied with uncharacteristic gentleness. Her personal shuttle departed approximately 3 hours ago. Departed? For where? There was no scheduled transport today. The shuttle's trajectory indicates departure from the Jupiter system entirely, Dr. Hawthorne. I'm sorry. Richard sank into a chair, staring at the impossible flower that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his broken heart. Somewhere in the vast darkness beyond Jupiter, the woman he loved had vanished as mysteriously as she had entered his life, leaving only questions and a light that shouldn't exist. 5 years. 5 years of searching every database, following every lead, and slowly watching his colleague's sympathy transform into polite concern about his mental state. Richard had become Europa Station's resident conspiracy theorist, the man who insisted his wife hadn't simply left him but had been swept away by forces beyond human understanding. "Good morning, Detective Hawthorne," Dr. Williams called out as Richard shuffled past the cafeteria, his arms full of makeshift scanning equipment. "Still hunting for interdimensional portals?" "Actually, today I'm investigating quantum entanglement signatures in organic matter," Richard replied without breaking stride. "But thanks for asking." The jokes had started innocently enough. Colleagues ribbing him about alien abduction and the case of the missing botanist. Now they'd evolved into an entire mythology around his obsessive investigation. Someone had even created a betting pool on what conspiracy theory he'd pursue next. His quarters had been transformed into something resembling a detective's war room crossed with a mad scientist's laboratory. Star charts covered every available wall surface, connected by different colored strings that mapped shipping routes, communication arrays, and gravitational anomalies. 3 modified workstations hummed constantly, running analysis programs he'd cobbled together from legitimate research software and questionable algorithms he'd found in the darker corners of the scientific database. "Aria, run another sweep of the outer system communication logs," Richard said, dumping his equipment on the central table where the mysterious flower continued its slow transformation. Over the years, it had grown into a complex crystalline structure the size of a human torso, its bioluminescent patterns becoming increasingly intricate. "Dr. Hawthorne, I have swept the communication logs 1,247 times. The results remain unchanged. No record of any transmissions to or from Dr. Serafina Hawthorne following her departure." "Then sweep them again. Maybe we missed something." The definition of insanity, according to human psychology, is repeating the same action while expecting different results, Aria observed. "I'm beginning to suspect you may be clinically." "Don't finish that sentence," Richard warned. "And while you're not diagnosing me, run a spectral analysis on the flower's latest growth patterns." A cheerful whistle echoed through the corridor outside, followed by the mechanical whir of servos. Zephyr, the maintenance android, rolled through the door carrying a steaming cup of coffee and what appeared to be a plate of cookies. "Good morning, Dr. Hawthorne. Beautiful day for investigating the mysterious disappearance of your beloved wife, don't you think?" Zephyr's vocal processors had been damaged in an accident 3 years ago, leaving his empathy programming permanently stuck in maximum cheerfulness mode. "I brought you some snacks." Nothing says serious investigation like proper nutrition. Thanks, Zephyr. Richard had long since given up trying to explain why the android's relentless optimism about his tragic situation was unsettling. Any luck with those sensor modifications I asked about? Oh, absolutely. I've recalibrated the long-range scanners to detect subspace anomalies, quantum flux variations, and what you called impossible energy signatures. The chief engineer thinks I've lost my processing core, but I told him we're conducting very important science. Zephyr's optical sensors flickered with what might have been pride. He seemed less enthusiastic about the project after I accidentally revealed we were looking for aliens. You told him we were looking for aliens? Not directly. I simply mentioned that we were searching for evidence of non-terrestrial intelligence that may have interfered with human affairs. In retrospect, I can see how that might have been misinterpreted. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache building. Any actual results from the modifications? Well, that's the exciting part. The scanners have been picking up some very interesting readings from the vicinity of Titan. Strange energy fluctuations that don't match any known phenomena. Of course, they could also be measurement errors caused by my unauthorized modifications to critical station equipment. Show me. Richard activated the holographic display, and immediately felt his pulse quicken. The data streaming from Titan showed regular pulses of exotic energy, following patterns that reminded him unnervingly of the flower's bioluminescent sequences. Arya, cross-reference these energy patterns with the specimen's light variations over the past 6 months. Processing. Dr. Hawthorne, there is a 94.7% correlation between the energy signatures and the flower's luminescence patterns. This is, statistically improbable. Richard stared at the data, his scientific mind warring with 5 years of accumulated desperation. Could be a coincidence. Quantum phenomena often exhibit seemingly meaningful patterns that are actually random. Or, Zephyr interjected with disturbing enthusiasm, it could be aliens trying to communicate with you through your mysteriously growing plant. How exciting. That's not how alien communication works, Zephyr. How do you know? Have you ever communicated with aliens before? Richard opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The android had a point, albeit an unsettling one. Arya, have there been any reports of unusual activity in the Titan sector? Ship movements, research missions, anything? Negative. The area has been classified as off-limits to civilian traffic due to navigational hazards. No official explanation has been provided. Navigational hazards around Titan? That doesn't make sense. The orbital mechanics are perfectly stable. Richard pulled up the navigation charts, studying them with growing confusion. What kind of hazards could justify closing an entire sector? Perhaps the kind that are best not investigated by obsessive xenobiologists with a history of conspiracy theories. Arya suggested. I'm required to remind you that your psychological evaluation is overdue by approximately 4 years. My mental health is fine. It's the universe that's gone insane. Richard stood up, pacing around the crystalline flower structure. Its light patterns were definitely responding to something, pulsing in sequences that seemed almost linguistic in their complexity. Zephyr rolled closer to the flower, his sensors scanning it with mechanical precision. Dr. Hawthorne, I've been analyzing this specimen's growth patterns for the past year, and I've noticed something interesting. What kind of interesting? The kind that might be important. The crystal lattice structure isn't random, it's forming what appears to be a three-dimensional map of local space. Look here, Zephyr projected a holographic overlay showing the flower's internal structure. These formations correspond to planetary positions, these branches match stellar coordinates, and this central cluster matches the restricted zone around Titan, Richard finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The three of them stared at the projection in silence. Even Arya's processors seemed to pause as the implication sank in. So, Zephyr said with characteristic cheerfulness, we're definitely dealing with aliens, aren't we? We're dealing with something, Richard admitted. But what, exactly, I have no idea. Dr. Hawthorne, Arya's voice carried an unusual note of urgency. I'm detecting increased activity in the flower's energy output. It appears to be building toward some kind of crescendo. The crystalline structure began to pulse more rapidly, its bioluminescent patterns shifting into configurations Richard had never seen before. The air around it shimmered with barely visible distortions, and his modified instrument started registering readings that shouldn't have been possible. Is it safe to be this close? Richard asked, though he made no move to back away. Define safe, Arya replied. I'm detecting exotic particle emissions, localized gravitational fluctuations, and what appears to be a stable micro-wormhole forming in the crystal's central matrix. A wormhole? Richard leaned closer despite every scientific instinct screaming warnings. That's impossible. The energy requirements alone would. The flower's light suddenly blazed with the intensity of a small star, and the air above it shimmered like heat mirage. Then, impossible as it seemed, a holographic figure began to materialize in the space above the crystal, translucent at first, then gaining solidity and definition. It was Seraphina. But not quite the Seraphina he remembered. This version of his wife wore garments that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, and her hair was adorned with what looked like living jewelry that pulsed with its own inner radiance. Most strikingly, her ears were no longer hidden. The elegant, pointed tips were fully visible, decorated with intricate metallic designs that enhanced their alien beauty. "Hello, Richard," the hologram said, her voice carrying harmonics that made his chest resonate. "If you're seeing this message, it means the quantum beacon has finally achieved sufficient resonance to breach the dimensional barriers." Richard's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the nearest chair. "Seraphina? Is that really you? I know you must have questions, my love. More questions than I can answer in this brief transmission. But I need you to know that everything I told you about myself was both true and completely inadequate." The holographic Seraphina smiled sadly. "My name is Seraphina, but it's also Lyrilleth of the Asterian Confederacy. I am your wife, but I'm also, well, it's complicated. This is either the most elaborate hallucination in medical history or we're about to make first contact with an alien civilization," Arya observed. "Either way, I'm recording everything. The truth is, Richard, I never meant to fall in love with you. I was sent to observe human scientific development, to assess whether your species was ready for contact. It was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission." The hologram flickered slightly. "But you made me remember what it was like to simply exist, to find joy in small moments and wonder in everyday discoveries." "You're an alien," Richard said numbly. "You're actually an alien. Half alien, technically. My mother was Asterian, my father was from a species you haven't encountered yet. The pointed ears are an evolutionary adaptation for detecting subspace communications." Seraphina's image seemed to solidify as the flower's energy output stabilized. "And right now, that ability is the only thing allowing me to send this message across several light-years of space." Zephyr rolled forward enthusiastically. "I knew it. I knew we were dealing with aliens. This is the best day of my existence." "Your android friend seems nice," the hologram observed with amusement. "But Richard, I need you to listen carefully. 5 years ago, I received an emergency recall. My father, the Asterian Prime, was dying, and I was his only heir. I had no choice but to return home." "You left me," Richard said, hurt bleeding through his voice. "You just left. I left you a message. The flower. It was supposed to activate much sooner, but Earth-based quantum mechanics are apparently more primitive than we realized. The dimensional resonance took years to establish instead of days." Seraphina's expression became pained. "I can only imagine what you've been through, thinking I simply abandoned you." "So what now?" Richard asked. "You're Asterian royalty, and I'm just a human xenobiologist with an unhealthy obsession with impossible phenomena. Now, Serafina said, her image beginning to flicker as the flower's energy output wavered, I'm queen of the Asturian Confederacy, and I want my husband to come home. The holographic Serafina flickered like a candle in cosmic wind, her image wavering as the crystalline flower struggled to maintain the dimensional bridge. Richard gripped the edges of his chair, afraid that if he moved too suddenly, she might disappear again. Come home. Richard's voice cracked. Serafina, I don't even know where home is for you. How do I get to an alien civilization that's apparently light years away? That's the beautiful part of advanced technology, my love. Distance becomes relative when you can fold space like origami. Serafina's smile carried that familiar warmth he'd missed so desperately. I'm sending coordinates to a rendezvous point at Titan. One of our ships will meet you there. Titan. But the whole sector's been marked as a navigational hazard. That would be our doing. We needed a secure location for first contact protocols without alarming your planetary governments. Humans have such interesting reactions to the unknown. The hologram gestured, and new data streams began flowing across Richard's displays. The energy signatures Zephyr detected were our ship's quantum displacement drives. We've been waiting for the beacon to establish stable communication. Zephyr rolled forward excitedly, his optical sensors flashing. This is the most wonderful development in the history of everything. Dr. Hawthorne gets his wife back, I get to meet actual aliens, and Arya gets enough data to keep her analysis subroutines busy for centuries. I am experiencing what humans might call mixed feelings about this situation, Arya interjected. On one hand, first contact with an alien civilization represents the greatest scientific achievement in human history. On the other hand, Dr. Hawthorne's conspiracy theories were apparently correct, which means I need to recalibrate my assessment algorithms. The holographic Serafina laughed, a sound that made Richard's heart ache with longing. Your artificial intelligence has quite the personality. Does she always provide such colorful commentary? Arya's been my only reliable companion through this whole mess, Richard said. Well, her and Zephyr. Though Zephyr's enthusiasm about tragic situations can be unsettling. I prefer to think of it as optimistic reframing. Zephyr announced. Every crisis is just an opportunity wearing a disguise. Speaking of opportunities, Serafina's image began to destabilize again. I need to warn you about what you're getting into, Richard. My return to Asturian space has created complications. What kind of complications? The kind where I'm now queen of a civilization that spans 12 galaxies, and my marriage to a human has caused what your politicians might call a constitutional crisis. Serafina's expression grew serious. Some members of the High Council view our relationship as a dangerous precedent. Others see it as an opportunity for establishing diplomatic relations with Earth. Richard felt his stomach drop. So I'm either a political liability or a diplomatic tool. You're my husband, Serafina said firmly. Everything else is just politics. But I won't lie to you, coming to Asturian space means leaving everything you know behind. Your career, your world, your species. There's no guarantee you'll ever be able to return to Earth. Dr. Hawthorne, Arya interrupted, I feel obligated to point out that this decision involves abandoning a prestigious scientific career to follow a woman who disappeared for 5 years without explanation into an unknown alien civilization where you'll have no legal standing or cultural context. When you put it like that, it sounds completely insane, Richard admitted. I prefer romantically adventurous, Zephyr offered. Like those stories where the brave knight rescues the princess, except in reverse and with aliens. I don't need rescuing, Serafina said with amusement. Though I could use someone who understands quantum biology to help solve a rather pressing problem we're facing. What kind of problem? The kind that threatens the existence of every sentient species in this galaxy cluster. Serafina's image flickered more intensely as the flower's energy output began to spike. We're facing an enemy that consumes entire civilizations, Richard. Something ancient and patient and absolutely ruthless. My people have been fighting them for millennia, but we're losing ground. Galaxy-threatening enemies. This just keeps getting better, Richard muttered. What am I supposed to do against something like that? I'm a xenobiologist, not a warrior. You're a scientist who understands life at its most fundamental level. The enemy we face. They're not entirely alive, not entirely dead. They exist in the spaces between definitions, and traditional weapons are useless against them. The hologram began to break apart as energy fluctuations cascaded through the crystal. I need someone who thinks differently, who can see patterns others miss. The flower's luminescence suddenly spiked to blinding intensity, and alarms began blaring throughout Richard's quarters. Sparks flew from several of his modified instruments, and the lights flickered ominously. Warning, exotic energy overload detected, Arya announced. Structural integrity of surrounding bulkheads compromised. I recommend immediate evacuation. No. Richard lunged toward the destabilizing hologram. Serafina, how do I find you? What are the coordinates? Titan, look for the ship that bends starlight. Her voice was breaking apart now, harmonics scattering across impossible frequencies. Richard, I love you. Whatever happens, remember that everything I told you about that was true. The hologram dissolved into cascading light particles just as the crystalline flower exploded in a shower of quantum fire. Richard threw himself backward as exotic energies tore through his quarters, turning his carefully organized investigation materials into confetti and leaving scorch marks on the walls that seemed to bend light around them. Well, Zephyr said cheerfully as the emergency lights kicked in, that was exciting. Shall we start packing for your trip to meet the aliens? Zephyr, my entire life's work just got vaporized by an alien communication device, Richard said, staring at the smoking remains of his equipment. I think exciting might be an understatement. Dar. Hawthorne, I'm required to inform you that unofficial modifications to station equipment resulting in structural damage may result in disciplinary action, Arya announced. On the bright side, I did manage to record the entire communication before the overload corrupted my sensor logs. You recorded everything? Every quantum fluctuation, every energy signature, and every word. Including the navigational data your wife transmitted before the system failure. Arya's tone carried what might have been smugness. I also took the liberty of analyzing the star charts she provided. The rendezvous coordinates are definitely within the Titan restricted zone. Richard looked around his devastated quarters, at the years of obsessive research now reduced to smoking debris. Everything he'd built, every lead he'd followed, every desperate theory he'd pursued, all of it vindicated in the most spectacular possible way. So, he said slowly, I need to get to Titan to meet an alien ship and travel to another galaxy to reunite with my wife who's apparently now an alien queen facing a galaxy-threatening enemy that requires my expertise in quantum biology to defeat. That's an accurate summary, Arya confirmed. Also, based on the energy readings from the communication device, I calculate a 73% probability that the station's senior staff will have questions about the explosion that just occurred in your quarters. Questions like, why did Dr. Hawthorne's apartment just emit more energy than our fusion reactor, and, should we be concerned about alien contact protocols? Richard rubbed his temples. How exactly do I explain this to the administration? You could try the truth, Zephyr suggested. People love honesty. Zephyr, if I tell them the truth, they'll either think I've had a complete psychotic break or panic about alien invasion. Neither option seems particularly helpful. Dar. Hawthorne, Arya interrupted, I'm detecting incoming communications from Station Command. It appears your explosion has attracted attention. The door chimed, followed immediately by concerned voices in the corridor. Richard recognized Dr. Williams from the geology department and what sounded like Chief Engineer Morrison demanding explanations for the power fluctuations. Gentlemen, Richard called through the door, I'm fine. Just a minor incident with some experimental equipment. Richard, we registered an energy spike that nearly overloaded the fusion reactor. Dr. Williams shouted back. What kind of experiment were you conducting? Richard looked at the smoking crater where his alien flower had been, at the scorch marks that still bent light in impossible ways, and at his two unlikely companions, a maintenance android with damaged empathy programming and an AI with severe attitude problems. The kind that proves I was right all along, he said quietly. Then, louder. Give me 10 minutes to assess the damage, and I'll file a full report. You can't stay in there if there's been a containment breach. Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. We need to evacuate this section until we can run safety protocols. No contamination, no radiation, no toxic gases, Richard called back, which was technically true. Just some overloaded electronics and damaged pride. Dar. Hawthorne, Arya said privately, they're going to insist on inspecting the damage. How do you plan to explain scorch marks that violate 3 laws of physics? Very carefully, Richard replied. And probably with a lot of creative interpretation of quantum mechanics. I could help. Zephyr announced. I'm excellent at creative interpretation. Last week I convinced Dar. Peterson that the weird noises in the ventilation system were caused by mechanical whale songs instead of my attempts to improve the air circulation with unauthorized modifications. That's not exactly the kind of help I need right now, Zephyr. The door chimed again, more insistently this time. Richard realized he had perhaps 30 seconds to decide whether to trust his colleagues with the truth about alien contact or to construct an elaborate lie about experimental equipment failures. Dr. Hawthorne. Dr. Williams called. We're coming in. Stand away from the door. Richard looked one last time at the impossible scorch marks, at the data files containing proof of alien contact, and at the coordinates that would take him to a reunion he'd dreamed about for 5 years. Arya, he said quietly, how long would it take to prepare a shuttle for departure to Titan? Approximately 6 hours, assuming you can avoid arrest for destruction of station property and possible alien contact violations. Then we'd better hope I'm more convincing than I think I am. The Asterian ship defied every principle of physics Richard thought he understood. It didn't sit in space so much as exist alongside it, its hull seeming to fold the stars themselves into elegant geometric patterns. As his shuttle approached the rendezvous coordinates near Titan, Richard felt like he was flying toward a living constellation. Arya, please tell me you're recording this, he whispered, staring at the impossible vessel through the viewport. Every quantum fluctuation, Dr. Hawthorne. Though I should mention that my sensors are having what could generously be called an existential crisis. The ship appears to be larger on the inside than the outside, which violates several fundamental laws of reality. Perhaps it's bigger on the inside because they've learned to use space more efficiently, Richard suggested, trying to apply scientific rationality to the impossible. Like folding a map. Or, came a cheerful voice from the cargo hold, it's magic alien technology that makes physics cry. Richard glanced back at Zephyr, who had insisted on coming along despite having no actual authorization to leave Europa Station. The android had simply rolled into the shuttle bay and announced that historic first contact events require proper documentation and moral support. Zephyr, you do realize you've technically deserted your post and stolen yourself from the station? I prefer to think of it as unauthorized shore leave. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't accidentally start an interstellar incident by offering to shake hands with beings who communicate through interpretive dance. The communication array crackled to life, and a voice speaking perfect English filled the shuttle. Richard Hawthorne, you are cleared for docking. Please follow the guidance beacons and try not to worry about the way your ship will temporarily cease to exist during the transition. Temporarily cease to exist. Richard's voice climbed an octave. What does that mean, exactly? Think of it as being digitized, transported, and reconstituted at the molecular level, the voice explained helpfully. It's perfectly safe. We've only lost 3 ships this year, and those were due to pilot error. That's not as reassuring as you might think. I'm detecting what appears to be alien humor in that transmission, Arya observed. The probability of accidental ship loss during their transportation process is statistically negligible. They're making a joke. Alien humor. Great. I'm about to be disintegrated by aliens with a sense of humor. The guidance beacons activated, and Richard felt control of his shuttle being gently taken over by the alien ship systems. The stars outside began to stretch and bend, reality folding around them like origami made of light. For a moment that lasted both an instant and eternity, Richard felt himself spread across the universe, every atom of his being singing in harmony with cosmic forces beyond comprehension. Then the shuttle materialized inside a docking bay that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight, and Richard was whole again, though he suspected he'd never be quite the same. Well, Zephyr announced cheerfully, that was either the most beautiful experience of my existence or a complete system malfunction. Either way, I'm impressed. The docking bay doors sealed behind them with a soft chime that sounded like distant wind chimes, and Richard saw figures approaching the shuttle. His heart stopped when he recognized Seraphina among them, no longer hiding her elegant ears or her otherworldly grace. She wore robes that seemed to contain actual galaxies, tiny stars swirling in the fabric like living jewelry. Breathable atmosphere detected, Arya announced. Though it contains trace elements I can't identify. Probably best not to think about it too hard. Richard cycled through the airlock and stepped into an environment that made his senses rebel. The gravity felt normal, but the air itself seemed to shimmer with potential, as if every breath contained possibilities he couldn't quite grasp. The walls curved in directions that shouldn't exist, and the lighting came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Richard. Seraphina's voice carried harmonics that made his bones resonate. She moved toward him with fluid grace, and he noticed that she wasn't quite touching the ground, her feet hovered perhaps an inch above the crystalline floor. So, Richard said, his voice embarrassingly shaky, turns out I married alien royalty. That's new. Technically, you married a half-alien anthropologist on a research mission. The royalty part came later. Seraphina's smile was the same one he remembered, warm and slightly amused. Though I suppose the distinction is academic at this point. Behind her, several other figures watched the reunion with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed horror. Richard realized these must be members of her court, and they were getting their first look at the human who had somehow captured their queen's heart. Your radiance, one of them said, his voice carrying the musical quality Richard had noticed in Seraphina's transmission. Perhaps we should proceed to the formal presentation chamber. The High Council is waiting. Of course they are, Seraphina sighed. Richard, I'm afraid there are protocols to follow. You'll need to be formally recognized by the council before we can. She gestured helplessly. Before we can figure out what comes next. Protocols involving the guy who's been living on recycled air and terrible coffee for 5 years. Richard ran a hand through his hair, suddenly conscious that he probably looked like exactly what he was, a desperate man who'd spent years chasing impossible theories. I'm not exactly dressed for meeting alien royalty. You're dressed like yourself, which is all that matters to me. Seraphina reached out and took his hand, and Richard felt a subtle electric tingle at the contact. Though I should warn you, Asterian formal customs can be intimidating. More intimidating than having my apartment destroyed by quantum communication devices. Considerably. Zephyr rolled up beside them, his optical sensors taking in everything with obvious delight. This is the most wonderful ship I've ever seen. Do all Asterian vessels fold space around themselves, or is this a special royal model? The court members stared at the android with expressions of complete bewilderment. One of them, a tall figure with intricate metallic tattoos covering his pointed ears, leaned toward Seraphina. Your radiance, is this artificial being part of the human delegation? This is Zephyr, Richard explained. He's a maintenance android with damaged empathy programming and an unhealthy enthusiasm for first contact scenarios. He insisted on coming along. I'm also an excellent judge of character and a reasonably good cook. Zephyr added. Though I should mention that my culinary programming is designed for human palates, so alien digestion might experience unexpected results. Fascinating, the court member murmured. We've never encountered a sentient artificial being that projects such optimism. Most humans find it unsettling, Richard admitted. But he grows on you. Like a benign tumor. Zephyr announced cheerfully. The procession through the ship's corridors was like walking through a living dream. The walls seemed to pulse gently with bioluminescent patterns, and the floors adapted to each person's stride, providing perfect support with each step. Richard noticed that his shuttle had somehow been integrated into the ship's structure, his familiar human technology blending seamlessly with Astrian design. Arya, he said quietly, are you getting all this? Every impossible detail, Dr. Hawthorne. I'm also detecting that this ship appears to be partially alive. The hull is composed of some kind of biometallic matrix that responds to the crew's emotional states. The ship is empathic. More than that. It's actively participating in the environment around us. I believe it's trying to make you feel welcome. The formal presentation chamber was a vast space that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. The High Council arranged themselves in floating seats that orbited a central platform like planets around a star, and Richard felt distinctly like he was about to be judged by cosmic forces beyond his understanding. Richard Hawthorne of Earth, Seraphina announced, her voice carrying new authority, I present you to the High Council of the Astrian Confederacy. The formal introduction proceeded with ritual precision that made Richard grateful for Seraphina's whispered guidance. He managed to avoid any major diplomatic incidents, though he did accidentally bow to a decorative plant instead of the chief counselor, which prompted what he hoped were suppressed alien chuckles. So, the chief counselor said when the formalities concluded, you are the human who has captured our queen's heart and thrown our succession laws into chaos. I'm the guy who fell in love with a brilliant botanist and spent 5 years thinking I was losing my mind, Richard replied. The chaos part was unintentional. And yet, here you are. A human in Astrian space, married to our sovereign, with no understanding of our laws or customs. The counselor's expression was unreadable. What do you propose we do with you? Richard looked around the chamber, at beings whose civilization spanned galaxies while his species was still struggling to colonize their own solar system. 5 years ago, his biggest concern had been tenure review and whether his quantum bacteria research would secure funding. Honestly? I have no idea, he said. But Seraphina mentioned you're facing an enemy that threatens every sentient species in this galaxy cluster. If there's a way my expertise in quantum biology can help, then maybe that's what I'm here for. You would help us fight a war against entities you know nothing about. I'd help my wife protect something she cares about, Richard corrected. The fact that it happens to be 12 galaxies worth of civilizations just makes the stakes higher. The council exchanged looks that Richard couldn't interpret. Finally, the chief counselor smiled. An expression that revealed teeth like crystallized starlight. Then perhaps, he said, we can find a place for both the husband and the scientist. Months later, Richard stood in his new laboratory aboard the Astrian flagship, studying quantum biological samples that challenged everything he thought he knew about life. The enemy Seraphina had mentioned turned out to be entities that existed in the spaces between matter and energy, creatures that fed on the quantum foundations of reality itself. Any progress on the defensive applications? Seraphina asked, entering the lab with the quiet grace that still made his heart skip. Some. These entities have a vulnerability to quantum-entangled biological matrices, essentially, life that exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Richard gestured to his displays, showing complex molecular structures that seemed to shift and flow. Your people's biotechnology is already partially quantum-based. We just need to enhance the entanglement properties. And Arya's analysis? She's having the time of her artificial life. Unlimited processing power, access to databases spanning 12 galaxies, and research challenges that would make any AI weep with joy. Richard smiled. Though she still insists on providing sarcastic commentary about everything. And Zephyr? He's become something of a celebrity among your maintenance crews. Apparently, his enthusiasm is infectious even across species barriers. Last week he convinced 3 separate engineering teams to paint murals on the inside of the engine cores, for morale purposes. Serafina laughed, and Richard marveled again at how the sound seemed to resonate with the ship's biometallic hull. I'm glad they fit in. I was worried about bringing them so far from home. This is home now, Richard said, surprising himself with how naturally the words came. Earth will always be where I came from, but this, he gestured around the laboratory, at the impossible technology and the view of alien stars through the viewport. This is where I belong. Even with galaxy-threatening enemies and political complications that make human diplomacy look simple. Especially with those things. 5 years ago, my biggest challenge was getting funding for quantum bacteria research. Now I'm helping develop weapons against entities that eat reality. Richard pulled her close, marveling at how she felt solid and ethereal at the same time. It's like the universe took my wildest dreams and decided they weren't ambitious enough. So no regrets about leaving your old life behind? Richard considered the question seriously. He thought about Europa Station, about his colleagues who probably still made jokes about Detective Hawthorne and his alien conspiracy theories. He thought about the research he'd abandoned and the career he'd walked away from. The only regret I have, he said finally, is that it took 5 years and an interdimensional communication crisis to figure out that the most impossible thing in the universe was right there in my kitchen, making terrible jokes about my cooking. Your cooking has improved, though. When your wife is queen of 12 galaxies, you learn to step up your game. Outside the laboratory's viewport, the stars wheeled in patterns that spelled out stories of civilizations rising and falling across cosmic time. Richard had once been a man who studied the smallest possible forms of life. Now he was part of something vast enough to span galaxies, connected to forces that could reshape reality itself. Aria, he called out, add a note to the research log. Day 247 of the Quantum Entanglement Project, still married to the most remarkable woman in 12 galaxies. Some things, apparently, don't change. Noted, Dr. Hawthorne. Though I feel obligated to point out that statistical analysis suggests your marriage has improved significantly since leaving Earth's gravitational influence. That's not how relationships work, Aria. Perhaps not. But it's how this one works. Richard looked at Serafina, at the laboratory full of impossible science, at the stars that held more wonders than he could explore in 1,000 lifetimes. 5 years ago, he'd been a man whose wife had mysteriously vanished. Now he was a scientist whose love had led him to the center of the universe itself. You know what? He said to his alien queen, his wife, his partner in impossible adventures. I think Aria might be right.